in our Understanding Government series lectures. We are just coming out of COVID, so it's kind of a gentle way to start for us. Normally we'd be just packed with things, but it takes a little while to get things booked. I can tell you for 2023, I booked 7 things today, so we're doing well for 2023, but we got to make it through 2022. We do have a few things coming up. On Tuesday night, the Shelbyville Middle School Jazz Band and Jazz Choir will take the stage and play a full program of music that is really rooted for the really young kids. They play some of the jazz standards that you'd expect from the 30s and 40s and maybe in through the 60s. But this is a good chance for them to get their performance chops on a stage that's not a school in front of an audience that they don't normally get to perform in front of. So if you have a chance, starts at 7 p.m., it's free, and come out and support those kids. We have our regular Friday Night Frights film series. We don't do many movies here, but many years ago, the Strand, back in the 40s and 50s, 30s, 40s, and 50s of last century, we went and we showed B-rate horror flicks on weekend nights, late. And now we do all this cool stuff, music and plays, and having Luke Britt here, how cool is that? Well, guess what? We are who we were. So we still do horror flicks on Friday nights late, once a month. We call it a Friday Night Frights series. We are doing a 1955 film called The Tarantula, and that'll be on June 3rd. Does anyone know the significance of that film? It was Clint Eastwood's very first movie. So, yeah, and that's 1955, so we're looking forward to that. We also have some other cool things. We have a band called Rusty Ship coming in on June 11th. We have the Indiana 38th Infantry Army Band performing here on the 28th of June, and that's free of charge. And then on through, we have on the 11th, we are also showing local film buff Frank Gullo made a lot of movies in the 60s and 70s around the area, and we are taking 2 months of our Community Treasure series, both June and July, and showing some of his films along with Doc Barnett's, and that is just going to be the coolest thing, and that's on June 11th. You can find all this stuff on our website. You can like us on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, or just give us a shout out when you see any of us in public. We're all volunteers, and we're happy you're here. So this group of lectures kind of explores where we are in government. You know, the heightened sense of government that we've experienced in the past 6 or 7 years is something that personally I feel is very good. And the more people that are interested, the better off we are. After all, the old adage, those who show up decide. And we want to show up and be at the table. And sometimes we don't understand some of the components of what goes on. Last month, we had the Indiana School Boards Association talk about board governance. As many of you know, that's something I do as well. And then we have the Public Access Counselor this month to discuss what he does. And then we also have, in June or July, we have Purdue University sending their economists in to talk about taxations in Shelby County, get us to understand that. You know, we can throw terms around that maybe you're not familiar with, and it brings everybody on the same playing field. And our final lecture is going to be the Shelby County Economic Development Corporation President Brian Asher, and he's going to show us what site development is all like. You know, we magically have things like Poet come locate here in Shelby County, and people don't realize sometimes that's a 10-year process. So he's going to bring a site developer with him, and we're going to learn how factories made it here. In our Community Treasure series, we talked about building Shelby County, and this was last month, and the factories of old. You know, when we were all forest before we were agrarian like we are now, we were one of the furniture capitals of the country, and many of us are still connected to that industry through the homes we live in. So it's always fun stuff. We're thrilled you're here, and please give a big round of applause to our featured speaker tonight, and welcome Luke Britt. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. I know that there are 100 things that you could be doing on a beautiful Thursday night, but you are here talking about government transparency, and for that I am not only impressed but also flattered that you are joining me for the evening, both those in attendance and those maybe watching on Facebook Live or watching the recording after the fact as well. If you'll indulge me, I want to give a little story here to kind of set the table, or break the ice rather, I guess. So, it's been a weird 2.5 years or so for everyone, myself included. And over that span of time, more often than not, my public speaking opportunities were limited to virtual engagements. I'd sit behind my desk at home and with my little webcam, and that was fine and great. But it's nothing like interacting with people and having that face-to-face dialogue. And so right when we were kind of easing, crowd gatherings and restrictions and things like that, I was invited to do to give a training up in St. Joseph County, up in South Bend. And before that event, they sent around questionnaires to all the speakers as kind of a icebreaker type exercise. And there were questions like, what's your favorite food, what's your favorite movie, all that kind of stuff. But one of the questions was, what did you learn over, the course of COVID, during quarantine, during isolation, all that stuff? And I don't know if I was just having a bad day or if I just misspoke, which is probably the case. But I said, my answer to the question was, human interaction is overrated. Now, what I meant to say, of course, was human interaction was underrated, because I'm very much a people person. I'm very much engaged in face-to-face personal dialogue. That's what I love to do. I love to come to events like this. So if you hear rumors floating around the state that the public access counselor is some kind of agoraphobe, I'm telling you right now that is definitely not the case. I'm definitely flattered and honored to be here today. I don't know if any of you have joined me before for one of my town halls, but I like to keep it loose. I don't stand on ceremony. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to interrupt and ask. I am here hopefully to impart some of my knowledge as far as government transparency and public access, and I am most interested in hearing from you. And selfishly, I'll also say that I learn from groups like this as well, whether it be citizen groups or groups of public officials, or just folks that are interested in getting engaged on the civic level. That's really what I'm interested in today, and talking about what you want to learn about and what you want to hear about. I've got some opening remarks and all that kind of stuff, but I'll open it up to that kind of conversational dialogue. I'd love to hear your questions, your concerns, your criticisms, if you're familiar with my work. I've got pretty thick skin, so that's okay too. So I want to tell you a little bit about my office and what I do to contextualize my talk tonight. And a lot of folks are surprised to learn that my office, even though we have a statewide reach, we cover not only the state executive branch, but also the judiciary, the legislature, but also every level of local government as well, from townships, municipalities, counties, and everywhere in between, any kind of board or agency, we have jurisdiction to address public access issues. But our office is staffed by myself and 2 other people. We are a 3-person team, even though our footprint is fairly broad. So we do the most we can with the resources that we're given. And I will say right now that I have an excellent team, and they make me look good, and all of my missteps and shortcomings are mine alone. But I am blessed to have a staff like I do. I've got another attorney in the office who we work through these issues very, very closely, and then an office manager who is just, she keeps us on track for sure. My point being that if you were to call an agency like the Family Social Services Administration or the Department of Child Services or the Department of Health, all of whom do great work, you might have to get through layers of bureaucracy to get to the person that you need to talk to. And we very much pride ourselves on being available. I answer my own phone calls, I answer my own emails, and my personal turnaround time, I set the standard for myself that I want to be able to respond within a day or two at most. I know from working in government, from engaging with government, from being a constituent and a community member, that that's a little bit unprecedented. But our small size keeps us nimble and to make sure that we're agile enough to address those questions as they arise. So we do three things primarily in our office. Number one is public engagement. Again, I find that the best way to teach and to learn is to get out into the community face-to-face with folks. And I have made it my priority during my tenure to do just that. All four corners of the state, everywhere in between. Next week I'll be down in Corydon. The week after I'll be up in Elkhart. And so I try to leave no stone unturned for folks who might be seeking out guidance and advice when it comes to transparency issues. So that's our number one priority. We do about 60 to 70 engagements a year. Like I said, some of that is virtual now, but a lot of it are face-to-face gatherings like this. Our the second element of what we do, and you might be familiar with this, and I know some of you definitely are, is we administer a statutory adversarial complaint process. I think of my office as kind of the buffer between community engagement and the courts, because we're dealing, and I'll go into this, but we're dealing with a set of statutes that places obligations on government units. So if they fall short of those expectations, if they're in non-compliance with those laws, it would be burdensome and cumbersome and expensive for a constituent to then try to hold their feet to the fire vis-a-vis the court system. It's unwieldy, it has its place, but it's expensive to hire an attorney, to file a complaint, to go through that entire process, and it takes so long. So the General Assembly back in '99, in its wisdom under Governor Frank O'Bannon, decided to have sort of an ombudsman office that now is known as the Office of the Public Access Counselor, to be that go-between, to give kind of a voice to folks who have those grievances, who still want to say, hey, something's not quite right here. We want an objective voice to make a decision so that we know whether we're on the right track, if we need to pursue this. And yes, some of that winds up in the court system, but at least preliminarily, at my level, at the administrative level, at the advisory level, that's where I come in. And so I will be honest with you, my tone and my voice has kind of changed in terms of how I approach that adversarial complaint process over the years. When I took office, it was much more adversarial than I consider it now. I look at those processes as a teaching moment, as an opportunity to educate not only the public but also government officials as to how they need to be acting in terms of open meetings, public records, public hearings, all of that kind of procedural due process notice type, all those considerations. And so we publish all of our opinions based on those complaints. You can find them online. Quick Google search of the Indiana Public Access Counselor will yield you, the link right there. But we publish those not to play gotcha with government units, because we find them in non-compliance on fairly frequently. But I don't like to do that. I like to use it more of a vehicle for education and for teaching, because that serves, I think, it serves the community better. That, okay, they might have made a misstep, they might have flubbed something, and I've been in government. I looked at my watch the other day. I've been in government for 15 years now, and I've made plenty of mistakes, my fair share. But I try to learn from those and to get better the next time and course correct, and that's how I use my office as well. And I'm not shy about getting after a city council or a township trustee over rights and obligations and requirements and all of that. But without that process, you'd have to go to court and have a judge do that. A judge who might not be a subject matter expertise in public access. Because it's, I've been public access counselor now for 9 years, and I'm still figuring it out. I'm still learning stuff. There's still nuance and wrinkles in those laws that I'm kind of unraveling. So that's the second thing we do, is that complaint process. The third thing, and I think maybe the most important thing, is to be that resource, to be that voice on the other end of the line, to know that there's a state, so for the public to know that there's a state official that'll just listen. And that's a lot of what I do, is just listening. I impart my advice and guidance, but sometimes folks, I find, they just want to kind of, blow out the lines a little bit, to know that there's someone there on the other end of the line that's going to take them seriously, because they don't often get that at the local level necessarily. And sometimes they do, but I just want to be that resource. And so I've instructed my staff to do the same, to be a good listener, and to make sure that we are staffed in a way that you call. We might be busy, but if you leave a voicemail, we're going to get right back to you. If you're going to send an email, you're going to get that response when you need it, not have to wait and wade through a bunch of red tape to get the answers you want. So that's kind of the flavor of my office and what I do. We deal with two main statutes, although access considerations are scattered throughout all 36 titles of the administrative code, of the Indiana Code, and all however many titles there are of the Indiana Administrative Code as well. We don't deal much with ordinances or resolutions on the local level. Some things are self-contained there, and some bylaws and local rules. We don't really have jurisdiction to deal with that, but we have a pretty broad scope of things we can address. But the two main ones are the Indiana Open Door Law, which deals with public meetings, and the Indiana Access to Public Records Act, which deals with public records, which is the documentation of the business of government. And tonight, although we can talk about anything you'd like, today my focus was going to be on the Open Door Law. And what I want to do here to kind of prime the pump a little bit and hopefully invite some questions is to go over the basic rule of thumb, the 6 main tenets of the Indiana Open Door Law, and I'll give a little commentary on each of those 6, but then kind of open it up for questions. So, normally, if I was giving a more comprehensive overview, unfortunately for you guys, we don't have time to do that tonight. But if we did, I'd have a PowerPoint. My very first slide, I violate the number 1 rule of public speaking, and I read that slide. But I have it committed to memory as well. And it basically says that the fundamental philosophy of the American constitutional form of representative government is that the government is the servant of the people and not its master. And therefore, it is the duty of government to provide information as to the conduct of its affairs. Now, that, fortunately, is the preamble to the Indiana Access to Public Records Act. The Open Door Law has one that's very, very similar. But I take those words very seriously. That's the legislature's intent. That's what frames my interpretation of the law itself. And so I don't know if we have any public officials in the crowd or public employees, but I try to impart that and impress upon those public officials that should be their starting point as well. We are either appointed or represented to do the work on behalf of the public, not on behalf of ourselves, not on behalf of even the people that voted us in. It's to our community at large, and that's the way I look at it. So that sets the table a little bit. But as far as the law itself goes, and I'm not going to get too far into the weeds, although we can if there's questions, but again, these 6 tenets are good to keep in mind when you're engaging with government. It basically says that anytime there is a majority of a governing body taking official action on public business, that gathering has to be open to the public, and the public is entitled to notice of that gathering. Let's break those down one by one. So a majority of a governing body. As far as the open door law is concerned, a majority is a numerical majority. That's 2 out of 3 commissioners, 3 out of 5 town board members, 4 out of 7 county council people. A numerical majority, more than half. Some local bylaws will establish what's known as a quorum, which is not a word found in the open door law. But a quorum could be something that, internally they decide, well, we need something more than just a numerical majority in order to vote on a particular kind of subject matter, or something that's elevated to the point that we need just more than half. Now, I don't regulate any of that, really. That's more for, again, the local government to decide how it's going to follow those types of considerations. But for the purposes of today's discussion, it's a numerical majority. And it also has to be about a governing body. Now, here's where things get a little bit squishy. And if I was talking to a schools right now, it'd be a little different conversation, but it's a little easier when we're just talking about government in general. A governing body, first of all, you'll know it by statute. You'll know it by kind of an ordinance or something establishing a governing body, town board, county board of commissioners, county council, things like that. But there can also be types of governing bodies that you might not immediately think of. Board of Zoning Appeals, Property Tax Board of Appeals, a redevelopment commission, a plan commission. Any of those types of policy-making bodies qualify as official governing bodies. If they're doing the work of government, if they're appointed as having a seat at that table, more likely than not, it's going to be considered a governing body. Not to disparage our friends in public education at all, but here over the last year, you'll find throughout some of my opinions that schools have played a little fast and loose with what that looks like at times. But we're kind of reining that in a little bit with their cooperation and kind of setting expectations and figuring out a way forward that, no, you can't have secret committees to talk about something really controversial like a school mask mandate, just because you know that's going to invite a lot of scrutiny on the part of the public. So we're figuring out a way forward with that kind of stuff. But I put in an opinion one time, and I don't know if this is the best way to put it, but I said, you know it when you see it when it comes to a governing body. And I think that's true, although as an attorney, sometimes you can't be quite that casual in a legal opinion. But even still, so once you have a numerical majority of a governing body, they have to be taking official action on public business. Now, what does official action on public business mean? Now, a lot of times I'll get calls that say, well, Luke, all right, I sit on a governing body, we met as a majority, but all we did was talk. We just talked about the infrastructure project, or we just talked about some type of government measure. We didn't vote, though. We didn't make a binding decision. We just talked about it. Well, the purpose of the open door law is not only to say that you, the public, have the right to observe that vote, you also have the right to see kind of everything that leads up to that vote, if done as a majority. So you get to kind of see how the sausage is made, the steps taken preliminarily to reach a decision, not just the decision itself. And that's where public officials and members of governing bodies are kind of like, ooh, I don't like that. And I get it. I have some kind of empathy for that, because when I was transitioning from the private sector to the public sector, it certainly made me a little uneasy, the fact that ostensibly the public was kind of looking over my shoulder at my work product. If I was in a private firm, You know, that work product would be between myself and maybe a partner at the firm and the client. But that's about as far as it goes in that vacuum. But when we choose to serve, our work product, again, for the benefit of the public, really anyone gets to see. And anyone gets to scrutinize that work as well. So I understand bristling against that notion to a degree. So all that preliminary decision-making process as a majority of a governing body qualifies, not just that final vote. But it also has to be about public business, and this is an important note as well, because in a small community, and I come from a small community as well, you might attend the same high school basketball game as other members of a governing body. You might even be there as a majority. You might be in the same church congregation or run into each other at the supermarket, But just being in the same place at the same time or engaging in the social type activities are not necessarily public business. If the county chose to have a holiday party at the end of the year to celebrate its accomplishments and the holidays, and they're socializing and engaging in that kind of fellowship, but not really talking about public business, that's okay. Open door law doesn't apply. That's separate from what we're talking about. So it is not an absolute in terms of that. So it has to be about whatever is germane to their official capacities as governing body members, as public employees, as civil servants. So one more time. And this, by the way, these first four I'm talking about, that's the recipe that goes into the meal of a public meeting. A majority of a governing body taking official action on public business. And then once you get those ingredients together, then there's two responsibilities that governing body must fulfill. Number one, like I said, it has to be open to the public and you have to give notice. Because what's the point of having these rules if you don't know when they're meeting? So the law says that 48 hours before you hold a gathering like that, you have to plan in advance. So 48 hours before, you have to give date, time, and location of that gathering. Hey, heads up, we're meeting, here at a certain time, on a certain date, you're invited to come. And then it has to be open to the public as well. And this has looked a lot different over the last 2.5 years than it did prior to, and now that it will going forward. Because it wasn't safe necessarily to gather in large numbers and to be in close proximity with each other during COVID, or during the height of COVID, I should say. So in that regard, the governor had the foresight to carve out some executive orders that gave governing bodies a little bit of latitude. And it was my job during that time to make sure that latitude wasn't exploited or abused to the detriment of all of this, the spirit of all of this, Just because now we can meet virtually as governing bodies, it doesn't mean you can take advantage of that to freeze out certain members of the public. So, one more time, at the risk of repetition here, whenever there's a majority of a governing body taking official action on public business, it must be open to the public and notice has to be given. So you are all about 95% of the way there to understanding really the totality of the open door law. Now with anything, there are exceptions, there are nuance, there is nuance, but really that's the basics. And so there, I've talked at you for a really long time. I put the lecture in this lecture series, but I want to open it up and see if there's any particular questions off of anything I said or anything else you might be curious about. Yes, sir.
If you could hold on a second, we have to make sure everyone online can hear. Also, hello everybody online. I forgot to say hi to you when I introduced everyone. Here you go.
Yes, sir. Thank you for being here tonight. I guess the thing that I would assume is, and what I'm gathering from a lot of the public, is two things. Bureaucracy is so large. We are large people. We have a lot of people. But the suspicion is how much of it is information that we can access is locked up because of the bureaucracy, not knowing our way through it, versus what's actually being deceptive. And I think that's the challenge that we as American people are wondering about. And it would be nice, and I'm not trying to put you on a spot or indicting anybody, but it would be nice to have an idea that there are folks like you who are willing to be open and help us as the public gain access to needed information. But we all know that there is deception afoot. I don't think we can all deny that. So.
No, those are excellent points, and my job's easy from that regard, because the Office of the Public Access Counselor was set up to be apolitical. So I don't really directly report to any of that bureaucracy or any kind of political consideration. So I'm able to be a little more free with how I talk, with how I explain things. But you're right. I mean, what gives me comfort as in the position that I'm in, and I'm, you know, I hate to say this, I have been in government 15 years, but I'm not necessarily a government homer. But I look at my colleagues who serve, and do I see missteps? Yeah, I'm guilty of it too. Do I see mistakes? Of course. Do I see sloppiness? Do I see unnecessary red tape at times, and sometimes warranted, sometimes not? I do. But from what I see, and I hear it again from all four corners of the state, at least in Indiana, I don't see a lot of corruption. Usually when those allegations are made, it's more of a consequence of some of that sloppiness and some of those mistakes. Now, are there examples? Are there outliers? Absolutely, 100%. Could we do better as government officials in explaining what we do and how we get there and the decisions that we make? 100%. I'm guilty of it too. I'll give you an example. So if I was talking to a group of public officials, and this tracks exactly with what you were saying, you know, when I'm trying to impress on them, when I'm trying to convince them that government transparency is good and it's not just some cumbersome inconvenience, I put it to them like this. I say, some of you are politicians, or you were appointed by politicians. What better way to demonstrate that you are the right person for that job, sitting at that dais or sitting around that table, than to be transparent? I sit on several governing bodies, and I don't sit there silent. I don't sit there, you know, texting my colleagues on the phone. I want the audience to know. I want to show off a little bit. You know, I want the audience to know that I am the right person for that job, that I was either appointed or elected for a reason, and I'm trying to demonstrate that through going through those thought processes to saying, here's how I arrived at a conclusion. And I will tell you right now, and I'm not naive to this, that if I sit on one of those councils and I make a decision, I'm not going to please everyone. I know that. And there is a public official that says that I'm right all the time is a fool. I'll tell you that right now. But don't let them attack how you got there, how you got to that decision. I look at public access like a math proof. You know, when I was in high school, one of the first times I had to show my work was in geometry class, or algebra class actually, you know. And you had to go through all these tedious, meticulous steps to demonstrate that, you know, you arrived at a certain conclusion. It's not so much different in government work, or it shouldn't be at least. You know, you're trying to show that you've taken these steps and you've gone through and you've been thoughtful and you're doing meaningful work. And that end result might not please everybody, but you can't impeach the process along the way. You can't say that I didn't put in the work, you know. And so that's what I try to tell folks, how to ease some of that scrutiny, how to ease some of that doubt and that skepticism, you know, and even in some cases some cynicism. And I think we've gotten to the point now as a society where, you know, you listen to, you know, what's going on the news, and that trickles down to us, and it's hard not to be cynical. But I always say it's good to be skeptical. Let's remove some of the cynicism out of it. And so, you know, but that cuts both ways. The responsibility, again, is on public officials to be forthright and to explain what they're doing, or else, you know, that there's going to be that cynical, you know, cynicism creep into the process.
We have a question online from Lisa. She says that in talking about public notification, she said that the old-fashioned public notice buried in the back of the classifieds may not be adequate in this day and age. What is being done about the situation?
That's a really good question, and there are a couple different ways to look at that. For a regular public meeting, it's kind of even worse, because regular public meetings don't have to be published in a newspaper at all. All they have to do is be placed in a physical location at the meeting place itself or at a principal place of business. So are there boards that try to exploit a loophole by putting it in the darkened corner of a courthouse where there's no foot traffic? Are they still meeting that? You know, David, we mentioned earlier about the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law. You know, does it meet the letter of the law? Well, maybe, but does it meet the spirit of the law? Yeah, not likely. But again, you know, if we are interested as public officials in letting the public know what we're doing, we're putting it in a conspicuous location. Well, you know, we're putting it front and centered on a placard in the lobby or on an LED monitor somewhere where that everybody knows where to come and to observe that process. Now, I do want to mention, though, with public notice, I do think, and I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but I do think that published notice is going to look different in the coming years than it has traditionally. So we might see more requirements about counties and municipalities having to put things on their website, where you can find those without subscribing to a newspaper, without leaving the comfort of your home. But you know, those kind of initiatives are coming up all the time, and eventually one of those is going to stick. Just hasn't yet.
Following up on Lisa's question, I know that there's public notices or notices about the meeting, but how about public notices about decisions that are going to be made at the meeting? For instance, a change in zoning or something that's going to be built in a community where they may not want to, and the community wants to have input. It's helpful to have a public notice sign as opposed to something buried someplace.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I agree. If you know, we were talking earlier about this kind of thing, and it's all too easy for those kind of boards to talk in some kind of esoteric code in some of those notices, and so you know, I'm more of a fan of putting more of a narrative in some of those to the degree possible to let people know what they're actually doing, and not just, you know, referencing an agenda item or referencing an ordinance by number. Well, what does the ordinance say? You know, what's the substance of it? What's the subject matter of it? So yeah, I think we can do a better job of that. But the other part is that role a lot of times was traditionally filled by local journalism too, you know, because reporters could kind of decipher that code to a degree and write a story on what a local government body was doing. You don't get that so much anymore. And I know that my friends in the press are kind of frustrated by that as well, just not having the manpower and the resources to really dig deep into those. And I think it's a disservice, unintentional, but nonetheless. The losers are the constituents that want to know about these things.
We have another question online, really interesting. This person has served with the State of Indiana board. They served for 4 years. And the question is, the attorneys for the board were very strict about the open door laws and went to great extremes to ensure the board was in compliance. My question is, if a government body has been cited repeatedly for violating open door and your office's, quote, teaching moment is not heeded, the attorney for that board held responsible to ensure compliance?
Ultimately, yes. You know, one of the shortcomings in my office, and I'll tell you why I think that's a good thing, but one of the shortcomings of my office is that we don't have enforcement power. So we can't fine, we can't issue an injunction, we can't issue civil penalties on a board that misbehaves, especially a repeat offender. Ultimately, all we can do is kind of say, there's been noncompliance, there's been a violation of the law. And don't get me wrong, I can be quite forceful in those teaching moments as well, but ultimately it is incumbent on the public, to kind of hold the governing body's feet to the fire, and maybe that ends up in a lawsuit. Now, I think it's a good thing that I don't at my level, because I will say that about 90% of all of the issues that come through my office are resolved in some way, shape, or form to the satisfaction of the complainant. Either there was a misunderstanding on their part, or if there wasn't and the governing body was doing something wrong, maybe they'll course correct going forward, and you won't have those repeat offenders. But when I talk to public officials, I say, listen, I don't mean to scare you here, but I've seen lawsuits that have yielded hundreds of thousands of dollars for public agencies that don't follow the access laws, that they owe to a plaintiff, to a complainant. It's not unheard of that they really get burned by that kind of misbehavior. And so, so I'm vocal about the consequences. It's not all just, I don't approach it with kid gloves, but I definitely don't play gotcha in that way. But the consequences are real and they happen.
Okay, we have another question.
Hi. First off, thank you for your time this evening. Just quick question with respect to what do you see as the most common stumbling block in these open door law violations by boards, by these representative bodies, and just, I guess, second part of the question is, what would be your best practices recommendation for avoiding that issue?
I think the root cause is either ignorance of the law itself, or the technocratic requirements of the law itself, or a bad faith interpretation of it to kind of cut corners sometimes. So that's the root cause. And so that's where I come in. That's why I'm here. That's why I don't think I'm yelling into the wind when I talk to public officials. But it's more important for me than ever to spread that word. That's why we do things like we publish a handbook that we put online. We do have those opinions, and we publish all of those. That's why I go out into the community. But as far as the number one kind of violation or shortcoming is probably within the public records world. It's probably less with the public meetings. Those are more glaring. If a public meeting procedure goes awry, it's pretty obvious. But with the record stuff, you mentioned before that, the idea that government can be territorial about their information and not put it out there. That's probably what I struggle with the most, is the documentation aspect of it and hiding those materials.
All right, I don't want to jump ahead. Talked about public meetings. Can you touch on executive session a little bit and what actually requires executive session and what is not okay for executive session?
Yeah, absolutely. So executive sessions is a legal term of art, and it is the one main exception to everything we've talked to. Those 6 elements. Executive session is a closed door meeting. The public is not invited. Still have to give notice, but it's a closed door meeting. And they're important, I don't want to be dismissive of executive sessions, even with my philosophy and the General Assembly's philosophy that the government is the servant of the people. There are things that subject matters that are sensitive. I'll give you a few examples. There are about 15 in the open door law and a few more scattered throughout Indiana code, but I'll focus on a couple just to kind of demonstrate, what the legislature's thinking was. First, let's say a town board is sued for whatever reason. And they need to meet with their attorney to discuss litigation strategy to defend their position. Well, it wouldn't necessarily make sense for that town board to hold that powwow with their attorney in a public meeting. Because if that happened, then the opposition might be tipped off as to that litigation strategy. So it makes sense that the legislature carves out an exception for discussion of legal strategy. That makes sense. That's pretty cut and dry. Another example might be, say you have an employee who is alleged to have misbehaved somehow. You know, got their, there's an allegation of anything from, you know, getting their hand caught in the cookie jar and embezzling something to a sexual harassment claim, something like that. Now, a board needs some kind of latitude to explore those claims without necessarily jumping to a conclusion and not only dragging a suspect's name through the mud, but also a victim or a witness. You want to protect those kind of things just as much as you would want to you know, protect the integrity of an investigation. So to talk about employee performance in that regard or a disciplinary issue, you can have those kind of discussions behind closed doors. What I fight against is those executive session justifications being stretched too far, or even worse, the legislature trying to expand those in certain directions. So some of my work is behind the scenes lobbying a little bit to make sure that doesn't happen. But like I said, there are about 15 different subject matters there that do qualify as an executive session, but they follow that theme. They're not just for convenience. They're not just because, you know, we want to avoid scrutiny. There's a theory behind those that makes some kind of common sense. But it's not a free-for-all. Once you get behind closed doors, because if you're talking about one thing, you can't talk about everything else. You can only have preliminary discussions in those executive sessions. You can't make binding decisions or take a vote. So there are some guardrails, there are some parameters, but it's just a little bit of latitude there for practical reasons. Another question?
So a question with having those closed behind the door conversations, what constitutes a violation with that whenever you're talking about emails and discussions about this is coming up for tomorrow night's meeting, how, you know, when they start discussing that and start having those conversations via email, because they're not meeting in person, is that considered kind of that, it's not transparent, of course, but is that a violation?
I'm going to give you the attorney answer. It depends. Maybe. No, to address one comment first, with the executive sessions, so generally speaking, when a complaint comes in about an executive session, I will scrutinize that situation a little more rigidly than I would something else, because that is that opportunity to go behind closed doors outside of public view, so you better mind your P's and Q's if you're going to do it. That's my take on it. With the email situation, man, when I took office in 2013, it was a little bit of a free-for-all. I mean, I was hearing of situations where council members would be instant messaging at the dais between each other with their laptops open, or, you know, fast forward a couple years, you know, they're group messaging on cell phones. I mean, what kind of a slap in the face to the audience is that? Not only are holding a meeting within a meeting and getting around the open door law, but are you really paying attention to the proceedings themselves? So I think that's being pretty dismissive, and yes, a violation. If done as a group, if you're talking about substantive public business, substantive policy type issues as a majority, and those group messages rise to the level of a dialogue, then absolutely, I would consider that not only a violation of the spirit, but also the letter of the law. If it's a group message, just say, hey, can we put X on the agenda and no other talk about it? That's internal governance. I don't really consider that to be, I mean, it is public business adjacent at least, but I don't consider that a violation, even if somebody else chimes in and says, no, let's table that until next month. So again, it could be. In context, it could be, but that would likely not rise to the level. But that's a really good question.
Hi, I have a question regarding agendas.
Sure.
We post agendas early, like maybe 2 or 3 days prior to a public meeting, but we attend the meeting and there's a different agenda at the table when we arrive. That seems to be not in the spirit of the law.
I call that the old bait and switch. You're telling the public one thing and then kind of pulling the rug out from under them and discussing something else. I don't think that's good practice at all. So here's the deal with agendas, and this is an area where, if someone lobbied for improving this law, I wouldn't be against it for sure. So with agendas, boards are not required to use them at all. They're not required to publish them unless they do have them. It's a public record and it has to be posted contemporaneous with the start of the meeting. It doesn't have to be given in advance, 40 hours notice. It just has to be there when you walk in. If they're going to use an agenda, the public, the audience has the right to have one and follow along with the proceedings. But to your point, if there's deviation from a posted agenda, what's the point of having an agenda? Inevitably, in the course of a meeting, things are going to come up. There are going to be tangents and either, new business under that or something else. You might go off and talk about something else, and that's okay, just to discuss something new, something that wasn't on the agenda. That's how conversations get started. But if you bring up something new, whether it's intentional or not, and then you vote on it without much, giving the public much foreknowledge of that at all, if anything, that's a terrible look. And at worst, it could be a violation as well. But I don't condone that practice at all. We put in our opinions, just that. So, but agendas are one of those kind of weird, squishy areas of the open door law. Any other questions about that stuff?
Cody, do we have any questions online?
All right, okay. So what happened?
Could you talk about boardsmanship as far as within meetings and how boards conduct themselves and the knowledge of board members?
Yeah, I can, both serving on a board and being an officer on a board, and a board president, a chairman. I can say that it is crucial that someone in that position not only sticks to an agenda and sticks to the proceedings and sticks to some semblance of rules of procedure, how to make a motion, how to take a vote, how to open up the floor to discussion, how to invite public comment, all of that stuff. But a board president has to be kind of resolute in that. Now, again, I don't want to throw public education under the bus, but I will say over the past couple of years, some school boards were caught a little bit flat-footed in this regard. And so they would lose control of a room pretty easily with a lot of agitation, a lot of public input. But with a public meeting, that is the time where the board gets to conduct its business. Now, we can have a philosophical argument about whether or not this is good law or not, or a good law, but the open door law does not guarantee the right for the public to participate in those proceedings. It only gives them the right to observe and record. So when we say it's open to the public, you get to sit there in silence unless invited to participate. It's a little different with school boards now, but generally speaking, for counties and municipalities, it's still the same as it's always been. So I always have been an advocate of a chairman or the board opening up to public comment. Again, I don't think I can be as good at my job without hearing from the people I serve. And in real time, and be put on the spot in real time at a board meeting, and having that maybe a dialogue back and forth. But that's, as you can imagine, if you've seen some of the, or if you've been to a, disrupted board meeting over the last couple of years, or you've seen them online, you know that can get out of control pretty quickly. So a board chairman needs to kind of stick to those rules of procedure and to make sure that they are in charge of the room and don't let things get out of hand. Just watched a video the other day somebody sent me of a public commenter getting walked off the podium or the public comment microphone in handcuffs, because they wouldn't abide by their allotted time and they were causing a disruption. I don't want to see that at all. I don't think it's right. I don't think it's necessary. It shouldn't have come to that. There has to be some kind of order to the proceedings, and the board is in charge of maintaining that order and those proceedings.
Well, we had a question online, but
Sure.
you just answered it, so
All
good
right.
job.
And following up with what you just said, I was on a school board in the 90s, and we had a parliamentarian. Is it on the books, the law books, that board councils, townships have to have a parliamentarian present in their meetings?
No, there is not. There's no requirement to follow an established set of protocols either. Robert's Rules is kind of the go-to, and it's going to have everything you need. But some boards are just more informal and more casual, and that's okay too. Especially some of the boards I serve on the state level, looks more like a working session, really, than a public meeting, and that's fine so long as it works for that board. But I have counseled other types of boards, hey, follow these procedures a little more strictly so that things don't get out of hand. But there's no absolute requirement in the law for them to do so.
Thank you. I had another follow-up question. When you talk about the 48 hours prior to, the notice for a meeting, you said the date, time, and location, but is there a requirement to put the purpose for the meeting? This is for the, I think, the special session.
Okay, so not generally. If it's a regularly scheduled meeting, subject matter is not required. Like I said, the agenda issue notwithstanding. If it is getting into the weeds a little bit, but if it is a irregular special session of the board of a county executive, so the Board of Commissioners, there is a subject matter requirement. So if they meet every, the second Wednesday of every month at 7 o'clock in their chambers, and they stick to that schedule, they don't have to post subject matter. But if they meet, on a different day for whatever special purpose, that's when they have to give notice.
Okay, we have a question online that I personally have been involved with meetings just like this. One was the ICC Road when we were at the casino. I chaired that meeting. We had 1,000 people there. They were all very interesting to hear from. But the question is, can the board limit the number of public who can attend a meeting, assuming it is within the fire code occupancy?
Depends. So, you have a regular public meeting. It's a sleepy Thursday evening in Shelbyville. You hold it at your regular chambers. Normally, 6 people show up in a room that comfortably seats, 25, 30. But for whatever reason, there's a mad rush and an audience just shows up and can't cram them all into the room. In that situation, if it's unexpected, if it's completely unanticipated, it's okay to say, sorry, we're full. Now there are ways to, you know, have overflow rooms or broadcast somehow over some kind of closed circuit television or, you know, Facebook Live, whatever. There are ways around that to kind of, as a fail-safe. But say that it's, you know, your example, highways going in, residential area, or up in Carmel. This happened a few years ago. There was an Islamic Life Center that was being put in, and the public hearing was invited, you know, a lot of scrutiny, a lot of controversy. So there were 1,200 people that showed up. So instead of having it normally where that BZA typically has their meeting, they moved it to the Palladium up there on Rangeline Road, which can hold that capacity. So there are ways to kind of ease that. Use school board as an example, you know, they know that they're going to be talking about, you know, implementation of a mask or public safety measure. And they know, you know, these days it's just a given that that's going to invite scrutiny and perspectives and, you know, on both sides. So if they were to hold it at an administrative building that has, you know, the capacity of 25 people purposefully, and they knew other folks were going to come that would exceed that capacity, you know, I can't find anything there but a violation of the law. I mean, it's supposed to be open to the public. You can't restrict it purposefully. And especially with schools, you know, there's gymnasiums, there's auditoriums, you know, there's cafeterias, all kind of places where you can move that menu to accommodate more people. So I have seen that circumstance a few times on both sides, some when it was anticipated and they were given a heads up and they didn't do anything about it, they didn't move the venue, and then cases where it was like, oh, well, you know, didn't expect this, you know, so.
Everybody can watch the Strand several times has been the alternate venue for some of these. We have done that very purpose, and I've done it a zillion times myself where we got to move things. Okay, we're sitting right at 8 o'clock. Does anyone have any final thoughts or final questions? Cody, do we have anything finally online? Well, we certainly want to thank Luke Britt and give him a big round of applause for coming and speaking to us. I'm sure we all learned things. Thank you very much to our Facebook Live audience. And don't forget, we have lots of cool things going on here at the Strand, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you very much.